I thought we were just going out to dinner. That's how Lauren presented it. 19 years of marriage, and I had learned not to question small gestures. When she said she wanted to try that upscale steakhouse in Portland, Oregon, I assumed it was a rare attempt at reconnecting. She insisted on driving, which I remember thinking was strange because I usually drive when we go downtown. She framed it as a treat for me, said I should relax, enjoy the evening, let her handle things. I didn't realize until later that it wasn't courtesy. It was control. The restaurant was dimly lit in that intentional, expensive way where every table looks important. A host led us past the main dining area toward a semi-private room in the back. I figured maybe she had reserved something special. Maybe an anniversary redo. Maybe an apology for the distance that had been growing between us for years. When I stepped into that room and saw Hannah Cole, Melissa Grant, and Tara Lawson already seated at the table, something in my chest tightened before my brain could catch up. The conversation stopped immediately. Not faded. Stopped. 3 pairs of eyes shifted to me in unison. Their smiles were stretched thin, like they had rehearsed holding them. Lauren walked in behind me, one hand briefly touching my back as if guiding me to my assigned seat. Assigned is the only word that fits. She sat me directly across from all of them, positioning herself slightly to the side, but aligned with them rather than with me. I didn't understand it fully in that moment, but I felt it. I wasn't joining dinner. I was entering a room where something had already been decided. I tried to lighten the mood. I asked how everyone was doing, made a small joke about not knowing this was a council meeting. No one laughed. Hannah exchanged a glance with Melissa. Tara took a sip of wine without breaking eye contact. Lauren's smile didn't reach her eyes. It was sharp, almost satisfied. Within minutes the comments began, disguised as casual humor. Melissa mentioned how competitive the job market was getting and how some people just plateau if they don't have the drive. Hannah added that ambition is attractive, that stagnation is exhausting to watch. Tara chimed in about men who get too comfortable and forget to evolve. They weren't looking at their plates when they said these things. They were looking at me. Lauren laughed. Not the uncomfortable laugh of someone caught off guard. Not the defensive laugh of a wife protecting her husband. She laughed like she was proud of the performance. At one point she said, "Marcus is just safe. He's always been safe." The way she said it made the word sound like an insult. Safe wasn't dependable or stable. It was small. Predictable. Replaceable. They asked about my career, but not out of curiosity. They asked why I hadn't pursued a management position in years, why I hadn't reinvented myself like other men our age. Every answer I gave felt inadequate before I even finished speaking. I tried to explain that stability mattered to me, that consistency had allowed us to build a life without chaos. Hannah smirked and said some people confuse fear with stability. I felt my face grow warm, but I kept my posture straight. I remember focusing on the polished surface of the table, on the reflection of the overhead light, trying to ground myself. The steakhouse smelled like charred meat and expensive wine, but all I could taste was humiliation. Lauren leaned back in her chair, watching me field their comments like it was entertainment. At one point she said, "We've talked about this, Marcus. You just don't push yourself." The we in that sentence wasn't us. It was her and them. I realized then that this dinner hadn't been spontaneous. This wasn't friends coincidentally gathering. This was staged. Thought out. Planned. I wasn't a husband at dinner. I was a defendant before a jury that had already reached its verdict. It wasn't just that night. Sitting there under the soft yellow lighting of that private room, I realized this had been building for years, almost 2 decades of small, precise cuts disguised as jokes, as personality quirks, as harmless teasing that I had convinced myself was normal. Lauren didn't ask what I wanted to drink when the waiter came. She ordered a bourbon for me like she was selecting a side dish, even though I had switched to scotch months ago. She didn't look at me for confirmation. She didn't need to. When appetizers were discussed, she chose the most expensive options on the menu without glancing at the prices, because the expectation was understood. I would pay. I always paid. The unspoken arrangement was that I funded the lifestyle while she curated the narrative. Her friends leaned into their roles like they had practiced them. Melissa tilted her head sympathetically and asked if I ever felt like I wanted more out of life. Hannah followed with a comment about how some men get comfortable and stop striving once they lock things down. Tara, swirling her wine, said Lauren had always been the adventurous one, the vibrant one, and that it must be hard to feel held back. They framed every insult as concern, every jab as empowerment. It was a coordinated effort to chip away at something fundamental, at my masculinity, at my worth, at the idea that I was enough. For years I had absorbed comments like that in smaller doses at birthday parties, barbecues, holidays. I told myself they were just outspoken. I told myself Lauren laughed because she didn't want to seem uptight. But that night there was no ambiguity. This was deliberate. I responded calmly because anger would have confirmed their narrative. I kept my voice even and reminded Melissa that her husband's constant business trips had become a running joke in their own circle after he was caught texting someone half his age. I mentioned it without raising my tone, just enough to tilt the mirror back toward her. The color drained slightly from her face. I turned to Hannah and referenced how exhausting it must be to rebuild your life after a second divorce, how resilience sometimes looks a lot like settling too. Tara suddenly found her plate fascinating. The mood shifted almost instantly. The confidence that had filled the room wavered. Their smirks faltered. I wasn't shouting or attacking, I was simply refusing to be the only target. For a brief moment I felt control return to me, not aggressively, but through clarity. That was when I felt Lauren's heel connect sharply with my shin under the table. It wasn't accidental. It was precise and hard enough to sting. I looked at her, expecting maybe a warning glance, maybe embarrassment. Instead, she gave me a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes and said, "Marcus, don't." Just that. Not because I was wrong. Not because I had crossed a line. But because I had disrupted the script. In that instant something crystallized in my mind. She wasn't embarrassed by their behavior. She wasn't uncomfortable with the insults. She was uncomfortable with me defending myself. The problem wasn't that her friends were disrespecting me. The problem was that I was refusing to accept it quietly. As the check eventually arrived and I reached for it automatically, I understood the pattern in a way I never had before. The drinks ordered without asking, the jokes about my caution, the subtle comparisons to other men who were louder, flashier, more reckless. Every moment had been a small recalibration of power, a reminder of my place in a hierarchy I hadn't agreed to join. Sitting there, wallet in hand, I realized she wasn't ashamed of how they saw her husband. She was ashamed that her husband was me. By the time the entrees were placed in front of us, whatever thin layer of civility had existed at the beginning of the night had dissolved completely, and the conversation no longer even pretended to be playful. The comments stopped hiding behind humor and started landing with deliberate weight. Hannah leaned forward, elbows on the table, and asked Lauren, not me, whether she ever felt like she had outgrown her circumstances. Melissa followed by wondering aloud if being reliable was just another word for being average. Tara didn't bother softening it at all and simply questioned whether I was enough for a woman like Lauren. They spoke about me as if I were a case study sitting in the room rather than a person sharing the table. What struck me more than their boldness was Lauren's participation. She didn't once attempt to redirect the conversation. She didn't roll her eyes or tell them to knock it off. She nodded slowly as they described me as predictable, as complacent, as uninspiring. At one point she even added that I had always preferred routine over risk, as though stability were a character flaw instead of a conscious choice. Hearing her validate their words felt heavier than any insult they could have crafted themselves. I tried to defend myself without raising my voice, explaining that consistency had allowed us to build a mortgage-free home, savings, a life without chaos, but the moment I articulated that, Melissa smirked and said I sounded defensive. When I stopped talking and chose silence instead, Tara commented that passivity was exactly the issue. It became painfully obvious that the trap was designed to be airtight. If I argued, I proved I was insecure. If I stayed calm, I proved I lacked fire. If I joked, I trivialized it. If I remained serious, I confirmed I was rigid. Every possible reaction fed their narrative. Lauren watched this unfold with a composure that felt rehearsed. She sipped her wine, occasionally offering a small agreement or a carefully phrased addition that made their points sharper. I realized she wasn't caught between loyalty to her husband and loyalty to her friends. She had chosen her side long before we walked into that restaurant. When the plates were cleared and dessert menus appeared, I felt an almost absurd sense of inevitability. Lauren didn't glance at me or ask what anyone wanted. She ordered the most expensive dessert on the menu for the table, adding an extra bottle of wine for emphasis, her tone light and decisive. The assumption hung in the air unspoken but understood. I would cover it. I always did. Funding my own humiliation had apparently become part of the evening's entertainment. Then Hannah said it, finally stripping away the coded language and polite phrasing. She looked directly at Lauren and said that she needed someone who matched her energy. The words were delivered casually, but their meaning was surgical. Not someone safe. Not someone steady. Someone else. Someone more. The translation didn't need clarification. Not you. Lauren didn't challenge it. She didn't laugh it off. She didn't say she was happy. She simply took another sip of wine and allowed the silence to stretch just long enough to feel intentional. In that silence, I understood that this dinner had never been about feedback or growth or concern. It was about reframing me in a way that made their conclusion feel justified. They weren't teasing anymore. They were dismantling my character piece by piece, and the most unsettling part was how calmly it was being done. Something in me settled after Hannah's comment, not in defeat but in clarity, like the final piece of a puzzle sliding into place. I stopped trying to navigate the trap and instead began speaking plainly, one person at a time, without raising my voice and without rushing my words. I looked at Melissa and reminded her, calmly and specifically, of the night she called Lauren at 2 in the morning sobbing because her husband had been caught again lying about a conference, and how she had begged us not to tell anyone while insisting publicly that her marriage was aspirational. I turned to Hannah and referenced the months she spent publicly shaming her second ex-husband for lacking ambition while privately draining their joint account before filing for divorce. I looked at Tara and mentioned the way she mocked stability despite having moved back in with her parents twice in 3 years because excitement had proven unsustainable. I did not exaggerate. I did not insult. I simply laid out facts that were already known but conveniently ignored. The air in the room changed immediately. The confidence drained from their posture. No one laughed. No one interrupted. The silence that followed was no longer orchestrated or smug. It was heavy and uncertain. For the first time that evening, I was not the one on display. Lauren's chair scraped sharply against the floor as she stood up, her face flushed not with embarrassment but with anger. She wasn't upset that I had been attacked. She was furious that I had disrupted the performance. Her voice cut through the quiet room, louder than necessary, sharp enough to draw glances from beyond the semi-private walls. She snapped that if I was so offended, then I should just pay and leave. There it was. No attempt to smooth it over. No concern about the damage already done. Just a directive. Pay and leave. In that second, 19 years compressed into a single, humiliating transaction. My value reduced to a credit card and a silent exit. I reached into my jacket slowly, feeling every eye on me. I could see the shift in Lauren's expression as she relaxed slightly, assuming compliance, assuming that despite everything I would do what I had always done, absorb the cost and disappear quietly. My fingers touched my wallet, and for a brief moment I felt the familiar weight of habit urging me to end the scene the way she expected. Instead, I paused. I pulled my hand back out and slid the wallet back into my pocket deliberately, making sure the gesture was visible. I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt an almost eerie calm settle over me. I told her she was right. I should leave. The confusion on her face flickered before irritation replaced it. She asked how they were supposed to pay, as if logistics were the true crisis of the evening. My answer came without hesitation and without raised volume. I told her to sell the ring because the marriage was over. The words did not echo dramatically, but they seemed to absorb the sound in the room. Even the distant clinking of glasses from the main dining area felt muted. Her friend stared at me as if I had broken some unspoken rule by refusing to play my assigned role. Lauren stood there, frozen, her anger suspended in disbelief. I did not wait for a response. I did not look back at the table again. I walked out of the room, past the host stand, through the heavy front doors of the restaurant, and into the cool Portland night air, feeling lighter with every step away from that table where I had finally understood that I was not leaving a dinner. I was leaving a marriage that had already ended long before I stood up. About 25 minutes into the drive home my phone started vibrating against the center console so aggressively that for a second I thought something was mechanically wrong with the car, but when I glanced down at a red light the screen was flooded with notifications, messages stacking on top of each other so quickly they blurred together, and by the time I pulled into a quiet parking lot to look at it there were 83 messages waiting for me. The progression was almost clinical in how predictable it was. The first few were pure anger, short and sharp, demanding to know what I thought I was doing and accusing me of causing a scene. Then came the accusations about embarrassment, about how I had humiliated her in front of everyone, as though the entire evening had not been engineered to do exactly that to me. A few messages later the tone shifted into bargaining, telling me to come back so we could talk like adults, insisting that I was overreacting and that it had all been a misunderstanding. By message number 41, the practical reality had apparently set in because she admitted the bill was nearly $400 and that none of them had brought enough to cover it, that she had to call her cousin to drive across town with a credit card, and that the restaurant manager was standing nearby waiting. It was striking how quickly humiliation became relevant once it was hers. The earlier messages about me being too sensitive suddenly softened into pleas that we could fix this, that 19 years could not just disappear over one dinner, that I needed to answer her. The shift from outrage to panic was visible in the punctuation alone, the sentences getting longer, less controlled, more frantic. Then her friends started calling. One after another their names lit up my screen, and when I answered the first call I was immediately told that I had overreacted, that I had taken jokes too seriously, that I should have thicker skin after being married this long. I listened without interrupting and then responded point by point, calmly recounting exactly what was said, exactly who said it, and exactly how Lauren responded each time. I reminded them that not once had she defended me, that she had instead contributed to the narrative, that she had told me to pay and leave if I was offended. There was a pause on the other end when the details were laid out without emotion, stripped of theatrics. I did the same with the next call and the next, repeating the sequence of events with the precision of someone recounting evidence rather than feelings. One by one the certainty in their voices dulled, replaced by discomfort. Eventually my phone rang from a number I did not recognize. When I answered, Lauren's voice came through uneven and strained, clearly using someone else's phone. She was crying now, the anger dissolved into something closer to desperation, asking me why I would do this, saying she had not meant it like that, insisting that everyone had been drinking and that things had gotten out of hand. I let her speak until she ran out of words. Then I asked her one question, keeping my tone level and steady. I asked her to repeat exactly what she had told me in that restaurant. There was a long silence on the line, broken only by her breathing. She started to say something about being upset, about not remembering the phrasing, about context. I repeated the request, not louder, just clearer. Repeat exactly what you told me. The same words. The same sentence. She could not. That night, sitting alone in the quiet of the house after the noise of the notifications finally stopped, I understood something that was both brutal and strangely clarifying. What happened at that restaurant was not an isolated explosion or a bad evening fueled by wine and ego. It was the final, polished stage of something that had been eroding for years. The dinner was not spontaneous cruelty. It was the culmination of a slow recalibration of power where my role had gradually been reduced from partner to prop. I replayed the evening in my mind with a different lens, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. The seating arrangement had not been accidental. The synchronized tone of the comments had not been coincidence. Even the escalation had followed a rhythm, testing boundaries, measuring my responses, pushing further when I absorbed it quietly. The humiliation was not chaotic. It was rehearsed. When Lauren tried to explain herself over the phone earlier, she labeled it harmless girl talk, as if that phrase could neutralize the precision of what had been said. She framed it as exaggeration, as venting, as something that strong men laugh off. The implication sat underneath her words without needing to be spoken directly. A real man would tolerate it. A real man would not feel diminished. A real man would understand that public disrespect is just humor filtered through friendship. But I had tolerated it. For years. I had smiled through backhanded compliments at parties. I had absorbed comparisons to other husbands who were louder, flashier, more reckless. I had allowed jokes about my stability to land without protest because I told myself that keeping peace was maturity. I convinced myself that choosing calm over confrontation made me the bigger person. In reality, it made me complicit in my own erosion. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that Lauren valued the approval of her friends more than the dignity of her husband. Every time she laughed along instead of redirecting, every time she shared private frustrations for entertainment, every time she minimized my discomfort as oversensitivity, she was making a choice. And it was never me. What unsettled me most was not the cruelty of her friends but the normalization of it. The expectation that degradation should be absorbed quietly, that responding with facts was aggression, that silence was strength only when it protected other people's comfort. The narrative had been carefully constructed so that any defense on my part could be reframed as insecurity. The trap worked for years because I allowed it to. I prioritized harmony over self-respect, convinced that endurance was loyalty. That night stripped away that illusion. Respect is not loud, but it is visible. Its absence is even more visible once you stop pretending not to see it. I realized that I had been negotiating my worth in small increments, accepting slightly less each time to avoid conflict, until the gap between what I gave and what I received became undeniable. It was never about jokes. It was about hierarchy. It was about being positioned beneath the people whose approval she craved. And the most difficult part of that realization was admitting that I had seen glimpses of it before and chosen not to act. I had mistaken endurance for strength and silence for dignity. Not anymore. I did not sleep that night, but I also did not pace or spiral the way I might have years ago. The anger had burned off quickly, leaving something colder and far more useful behind. By the time the sun came up, the situation no longer felt emotional. It felt logistical. At 8 in the morning I was sitting in an attorney's office, calm enough that the receptionist probably assumed I was there for routine paperwork rather than the dismantling of a 19-year marriage. I laid everything out plainly. No children. I contributed roughly 80% of the household income. Joint accounts. Shared property. Clear witnesses to the incident if character ever became relevant. I forwarded every message from the night before, all 83 of them, organized and timestamped. I had already taken screenshots and backed them up in multiple places before even leaving the driveway. The attorney listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting down notes, occasionally asking precise questions about assets and timelines. There was something grounding about the structure of it, the shift from emotional chaos to procedural clarity. We discussed freezing the joint accounts temporarily to prevent impulsive withdrawals. We discussed documentation, financial disclosures, and next steps. Every instruction was practical. Every response from me was measured. I was not there to vent. I was there to act. When I walked out of that office, I felt a strange steadiness settle over me. Not relief, not triumph, just alignment between what I knew and what I was doing. My phone vibrated again before I even reached my car. Lauren's name flashed across the screen, followed by a message asking if we could talk like adults, saying we owed each other that much after nearly 2 decades. The phrasing was almost ironic. The night before, adulthood had meant paying and leaving quietly. Now it meant sitting down and repairing the damage on her terms. I stared at the message for a moment, noticing that there was no acknowledgement of what she had said in the restaurant, no ownership of the dismissal, no recognition of the pattern. It was framed as a misunderstanding, as heightened emotions, as something that could be smoothed over with the right conversation. The same reframing, just softer. I typed 2 words and sent them without elaboration. Through attorneys. There was no dramatic satisfaction in sending it. It was not revenge. It was boundary. I understood with uncomfortable clarity that I was not ending a marriage over one sentence spoken in anger. I was ending it because that sentence distilled years of quiet erosion into something undeniable. It revealed who she had become when stripped of pretense, and more importantly, it revealed who I had allowed myself to become in response. For years I had negotiated downward, trading small pieces of self-respect for temporary peace, convincing myself that stability justified silence. That dinner did not create the fracture. It exposed it. And sitting in that attorney's office, organizing finances instead of arguments, I realized that the decision in front of me was not fueled by rage or humiliation. It was fueled by recognition. I could not control who she chose to value or how she chose to perform her marriage in front of others, but I could control whether I remained in a role that required me to be smaller than I was. Clarity does not feel loud. It feels inevitable. That night I slept in the guest room of the house I had mostly paid for, not as a gesture of punishment and not as an act of martyrdom, but because the master bedroom no longer felt like a space that belonged to the person I was. That room held the version of us that had existed in photographs and holiday cards, the version built on shared plans and quiet compromises, and I could not walk into it without feeling the weight of something that had already dissolved. The guest room was smaller, simpler, stripped of symbolism, and that simplicity felt honest. The house was unusually quiet. No tense energy humming under the surface, no anticipation of the next passive comment or subtle critique, no calculation about which topics were safe and which might trigger another comparison to someone more exciting, more ambitious, more anything. For the first time in years I was not measuring my words in advance. I was not replaying conversations in my head to check whether I had sounded inadequate. There was no tightness in my chest, no low-level anxiety disguised as normal marital friction. There was just silence. I lay there staring at the ceiling and expected regret to surface, expected a wave of panic about the permanence of what I had set in motion, but what I felt instead was relief so steady it almost startled me. Not the dramatic relief of escape, but the quiet relief of alignment. I had spent years convincing myself that endurance was strength, that absorbing disrespect was maturity, that paying the bill without comment was responsibility. Somewhere along the way, responsibility had morphed into obligation without reciprocity, and stability had been reframed as mediocrity. 19 years ended with 6 words in a restaurant, but those words were not the true ending. The real ending happened in smaller, quieter moments long before that night, each time I chose peace over self-respect, each time I let a joke slide because confrontation felt unnecessary, each time I funded an evening where I was the punchline. The dinner did not destroy the marriage. It revealed its shape without decoration. Lying in that guest room, I realized that I did not feel abandoned. I felt returned to myself. The absence of tension was more telling than any argument could have been. There was no urge to text her, no impulse to explain again what should have been obvious. The clarity from the morning remained intact. For years I had allowed my role to shrink into something transactional, something defined by provision rather than presence. I had been dependable, predictable, financially consistent, and somewhere in that consistency I had allowed myself to be reduced to a function. The ATM analogy had started as a joke among her friends, then evolved into an expectation, and I had quietly fulfilled it because it felt easier than challenging it. That night, in a smaller bed in a quieter room, I understood that what ended was not just a marriage but a pattern of self-erasure. The silence did not feel empty. It felt earned. Marcus Whitaker stopped being an ATM and remembered he was a man.